I grew up in the USSR, and there the propaganda you got was alternate reality propaganda. My school told me to love Lenin more than my parents. This was falsehood peddled at you, designed to persuade you of a coherent alternate picture of reality. This is very different to Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda is not alternate reality propaganda. Russian propaganda is post-truth propaganda. It's designed to persuade you not into an opinion, but into inaction, into not doing politics. Russian propaganda asks you to not have political opinions, but it wants you to have too minimal opinions about political opinions. First, participating in politics is a bad idea. Only a fool does that. Private freedom is good, but public freedom is for idiots. This is an extreme project of depoliticization. The second opinion is a back-of-the-napkin theory of truth, which says who knows what, if anything, is true, which is, of course, a self-refuting position. To understand this more deeply, let's look at what I take to be the four central pillars of Russian Putinite propaganda. The first pillar of Putin's propaganda is doubt about truth itself. Here we get to the heart of how this propaganda works. It wants to convert the thirst each human has for truth into resistance to accepting that anything is true. It exploits your desire not to get duped by politics, to get you to doubt everything about politics, and eventually doubt the very possibility of acquiring truthful beliefs about politics at all. To apply this pillar to a terrible thing Russia does in Ukraine, their defense won't be, this isn't true, we didn't do it, but nobody can really know what's true. The second pillar of Russian propaganda is foregoing of consistency. About a terrible thing in Ukraine, the Kremlin might peddle two incompatible messages. It didn't happen, and it happened, but somebody else did it. The third pillar of Russian propaganda is saturation, volume, flooding. About a terrible thing done in Ukraine, this might mean not taking two, but 8 incompatible positions. It didn't happen, somebody else did it, it was staged, we did it, but we were forced to, Ukraine did it, NATO did it, the planet Saturn did it, the planet Saturn didn't do it, but its rings did. The fourth pillar of Russian propaganda is motivational internality. Think of this as the maxim that a person is only going to be motivated by what already motivates them. Unlike Soviet propaganda, Russian propaganda doesn't want to put into your head something that isn't already there. It wants to start with what already motivates you and then manipulate that. It's not trying to change your ideology. It's helping you spin out of control via your own ideological logic. Interfering in our democracies, the Kremlin's aim is not to take sides in our politics, but to make our political systems ungovernable by exacerbating what already divides us. Ungovernability is the aim. At this point, we need to recognize that Putin's propaganda has changed in a way that affects Russians but doesn't affect us in the West. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian propaganda has moved 20 or 30% back to Soviet-style alternate reality propaganda. The content of this propaganda isn't Soviet. After all, the Soviet Union was a distorted hard-left regime, and Putin's regime is a fascistized hard-right tyranny. But the form is Soviet. It is alternate reality propaganda. 70% of the time, the Kremlin now tells Russians, believe nothing and nobody, not even us. 30% of the time, it now says, do believe us after all, we have an ideology to sell you. This is happening because Russia is a fascistized regime without a fascistized population. The regime knows that this disbalance is unsustainable, but it doesn't know how to change it, when to change it, and whether changing it is something that it can control. To sum up, for us, it's post-truth propaganda. For Russians, it's a combination of post-truth propaganda and alternate reality propaganda. Before we get to the biggest harm that Russian propaganda does that most people don't understand, we have to spend some time thinking about the word organic. Russian propaganda isn't just a tool of the Kremlin, it's a species of an organic political disease circulating around the world. With a collapse of seriousness in Western politics, we increasingly see two new breeds of politician here at home: the political entrepreneur and, more destructively, the post-truth populist. The political entrepreneur serves the political landscape for personal advancement. They're not out to positively break the democratic game, but if that is the consequence of self-advancement, so be it. These politicians are frequently liars, they see politics in purely instrumental terms, and they justify the social harm their very presence in politics does by appealing to the language of personal self-realization and the pursuit of authenticity. Post-truth populists are different from political entrepreneurs because they are not liars. Liars obscure particular truths. Post-truth populists obscure the difference between truth and lies itself. Politicians have always lied, but what's different about post-truth populists isn't that they lie, but that they have consciously given up on trying to make their lies internally consistent. Post-truth politics is not politicians lying. Post-truth politics is a kind of co-conspiracy between politician and citizen in which both parties half agree that truth doesn't matter. Post-truth populists flourish where citizens experience what I call the four big feelings of distrust. Here they are, from least to most worrying. One is feeling unsafe, which goes with the thought that your political institutions are incompetent. You are in unsafe hands. The second is feeling powerless. This goes with the thought that there is nothing you can do to inflect the political process. You reach out to touch politics, but you can't touch it. The third is feeling betrayed, which goes with the thought that your political institutions prioritize others over you, thereby making them evil. And fourth, we have the worst feeling, the feeling of opacity, which goes with the thought that you can no longer see politics. Your political institutions no longer make sense. This is a lapse into magical thinking, which makes you not mind if your political institutions get destroyed, because they don't make sense anyway. The causes of this crisis range from 1, the untethering of communal bonds in our societies, 2, the disinhibiting and atomizing effect of social media, 3, mechanisms of exclusion, and 4, ideologies of self-realization which give up on solidarity and the public good. Everything we've described is organic in the sense that it would still be happening if the malign actors interfering in our democracies vanished off the face of the earth. But they haven't vanished. They're trying to exploit and exacerbate our democratic incapacity for their purposes. We want them to lose, but at the moment we might be losing. It's now that we come to the biggest harm Russian propaganda does that most people do not recognize. The harm Russian propaganda seeks to do to Western democracies is DIY harm. Russian propaganda is unreasonably effective because it seeks to trigger a self-destructive response on our part, which if we want to save our democracies, we've got to stop. They want us to freak out about their interference so dramatically that our freak out about the interference does more harm than the interference itself. The Kremlin wants the architects of the damage to our democracies to be not just people who parrot Russian propaganda, but you and me, people who might lose their cool because they're worried about Russian propaganda and interference. The Kremlin wins if we lose our capacity to tell apart homegrown democratic crisis from malign foreign interference. And the Kremlin wins more if we lose not just that capacity, but our capacity to engage in democratic regeneration, because we think our problems are externally caused, a product of malign foreign interference, and therefore do not need a fix. The Kremlin wins if we lapse into magical thinking and ourselves become conspiracy theorists by taking problems that are 95% homegrown and 5% Kremlin exaggerated and seeing them as 5% homegrown and 95% Kremlin caused without evidence, because like a conspiracy theorist, we think that the evidence that really matters is evidence that is not visible to the eye. Now we need to make a comment about Trump and Putin's position on the 2024 US election, because it has changed since 2016.
The power play between the two alpha males was more muted.
In 2016, the Kremlin didn't necessarily want Trump to win. They themselves fell for the mainstream illusion that Trump couldn't win. They backed him as a disruptor, hoping for a more divided USA and a weakened Hillary. But in 2024, they want Trump to win because they believe he is their best bet for ungovernability and weakness on Ukraine. The Kremlin do feel burned by Trump. They think that in his first term, he failed to generate an elite around him and got co-opted into policies that the Kremlin thinks were tough on Russia. So their preference for Trump is clear, but not euphoric. What do we do about all of this? We don't have 4 hours, so this is what I want to say to you as a fellow Western citizen, as a political philosopher, and as a minor public intellectual. Number one, let's not be Tucker Carlson. Let's not buy Kremlin siren songs about how they're offering a civilizational alternative to a decaying West. When they say this, it's a blend of political technology and mystical obscurantism. Russia doesn't offer a truer alternative of conservative values. In fact, its main fault is that it is a hellscape of hyper-neoliberal values. Russia does not offer an anti-colonial alternative to US hegemony. If you're worried about US imperialism, you should be worried about Russian imperialism more, because it has nothing to offer except violence and a mystical vision of Russia's self-propulsion at the expense of the world. Number two, let's not allow the Kremlin to dictate the terms of debate in the West. One way of helping the Kremlin is to cede to them conceptual ground. The Kremlin wants supporters of Ukraine to accuse each other of being Russian sympathizers. So if you support Ukraine, but you're going around calling everything you disagree with a Russian narrative, you may be helping Russian propaganda. Number three, let's not decontextualize what fellow citizens or experts or politicians say. When academic Smith says we need a better strategy because Russia is strong, don't be activist Jones who comes along and says Smith is a Russian bootlicker. What Jones does is disgraceful. They decontextualized Smith and recontextualized him in a context that was never there. Instead, trust that you win by thinking freely and being truthful more than you win by winning. Number four, let's not freak out about our domestic problems. It's in part as a counter to Russian propaganda that I repeatedly say that our democracies are heading out of the bay into open ocean, but that they will not sink. The Kremlin narrative that our democracies are not real and that they will collapse is not just the Kremlin's judgment and the Kremlin's tactic, it's the Kremlin's theory of victory over us. Their dogma is that we will do most of the work ourselves. They expect polarized Western societies to dig their own graves until Putin's push to dissolve NATO by exposing Article 5 need no more than a nudge. Number five, let's not confuse the volume of Russian interference with efficacy. Trying is not succeeding. Russia's intervention in the 2016 US election was distinctive for being incompetent. Number six, focusing on the domestic causes of our troubles which the Kremlin seeks to exacerbate makes us more resilient to Kremlin propaganda. The Kremlin wins if we become ungovernable. The Kremlin loses if we renew our democracies. By reforming electoral systems, by reforming political parties, by bringing politics closer to citizens and their communities, by tackling inequality, by putting solidarity and the public good and not identity politics at the center of our social justice agenda, by taking action on the crisis of civility and atomization that social media causes. This homework immunizes us from Russian propaganda and allows us to recognize Russian interference without freaking out about it. As we recognize Kremlin propaganda for what it is, we need to challenge it. There is an information war going on, and we need to play it offensively and not just defensively. We have to fund and better institutionalize a proactive informational challenge to the Kremlin at home, abroad, and on the Russian space. It is a problem that the Kremlin are trying to politicize our space, but we are not trying or even thinking much about politicizing theirs. A key theme of this talk has been the sense of political responsibility of an effective citizen. Thinking about political responsibility is crucial for us. To understand that notion more, watch this video next, provocatively titled "Why All Russians Are Responsible for Putin's War."